No, there are a couple of questions, also I would like to ask about this: that why are these vaccines coming? Always seem to be coming from BARDA or DARPA or something related to U.S. military. This is some sort of issue that is difficult to understand for most people. Don't believe it when I tell them this.
Näihin kysymyksiin tohtori Meryll Nass osannee vastata. Jos googletatte hänet, näette uutisia lääkärilupansa menettäneestä disinformaatiolevittäjästä.
Some of this is my fault and other people's fault.
I thought it was. I was going to blame you.
Jos katsotte pidemmälle, löydätte bioterrorismin asiantuntijan, lääketieteen ammattilaisen sekä ihmiskunnan vapauden ja terveyden puolesta nyt kamppailevan aktivistin, joka kerää ja jäsentää tietoa muun muassa WHO:n, EU:n ja Yhdysvaltojen virastoviidakon sekä pharman välisestä korruptiosta. Tässä haastattelussa tohtori Meryll Nass kertoo Suomeen tuotavan lintuinfluenssarokotteen taustoista sekä itse taudista.
Well, one of my slides shows that some of this work is being done by BARDA.
Yeah.
And then Welcome Leap is another organization that is affiliated with intelligence and DARPA. The former head of DARPA is now the head of Welcome Leap. This is from the Wellcome Trust. That Jimmy Farrar was the CEO of Wellcome Trust, and he came up with the idea of vaccines in 100 days.
Yeah.
With dates. So
there are so many of these organizations. Can I could make a short introduction if you could, because people don't know you too well here. Because Finland is within a bubble that. So I could say that I have been trying to contact Finnish authorities about this bird flu vaccine, and they don't seem to know anything about it. So our experts don't know much about it. But I should say that you are somehow an expert on this. So could you please shortly tell a bit who you are and why you are an expert? Yeah.
Sure.
Hi.
Yeah, my name is Dr. Meryll Nass. I am a physician in the United States. I practiced medicine for 42 years. My medical license was suspended 2 years ago for treating patients with ivermectin and hydroxychloroquine and warning about the COVID vaccines. I have testified 6 times to the U.S. Congress. I have been a consultant to the U.S. Director of National Intelligence, to the World Bank, to the Ministry of Health of Cuba, and to the U.S. government's General Accounting Office, which is an investigative arm of Congress. I am the first person in the world to have proven that an epidemic was due to biological warfare. I published that paper 32 years ago, and it was an epidemic of anthrax in Rhodesia during its civil war. So my background is in pandemics, biological warfare, internal medicine, and vaccine side effects. I also am an expert on the anthrax vaccine. I wrote the first review article on anthrax vaccine, and I am fairly knowledgeable about other vaccines and the processes that are used to regulate them.
Yes, that should tell my audience that you are somehow an expert on this, because it really has been a trouble of finding an experts about vaccines in Finland. So what can you tell about this bird flu vaccine that Finland would be a first country to get?
Yes. So I'll share, let me see, I'll share my screen.
Okay.
Now, can you see my birds?
Yes, I can, yes.
Okay, good. All right, so there are many viruses in the world. Scientists have identified several hundred viruses that can affect humans adversely. And there are many more viruses that don't seem to harm humans. And there are many viruses that harm animals, and some that harm animals harm humans. Many only affect 1 or 2 species. And bird flu is one of, many viruses that was known to be harmful to birds, but it had never apparently harmed a human until 1997, when a human case was discovered in Hong Kong. There were about 20 cases identified altogether, and I think about 6 deaths in Hong Kong in 1997. So for the first time, scientists realized that this could potentially become a problem for humans, but all of the people who were affected had direct contact with chickens, and there was no evidence of any spread person to person. A number of chickens were culled in Hong Kong at that time to control this. At that time, the disease in humans appeared to be very virulent, and of the people who identified to have been infected with this virus, about 60% died. And so shortly thereafter, by 2003, a concept was developed amongst scientists who work in bioterrorism and biodefense. Since it would never be possible to create a vaccine normally takes 10 to 15 years or longer to be developed and assessed for its safety and effectiveness. They realized it would never be possible to create a vaccine in time to deal with some future pandemic. So an idea took shape and was accepted in Europe and the US that we could make what they termed mock-up vaccines, or vaccines that people guessed might be similar to a vaccine that would be needed in the future. And we could make these mock-up vaccines, we could do some testing on them and put them through some sort of regulatory process. And then in the future, vaccines could be developed similarly, and we could use the regulatory procedures that had been done on the mock-up vaccines and get vaccines of the future approved very, very quickly. So yes?
Can I ask that, how can they tell that this mock-up version of the vaccine actually works on this?
They can't. They can't. This is basically a scheme to get around 2 problems. The first problem being you can't develop a vaccine fast enough for it to be useful during an epidemic. And the second problem is we don't know what the vaccines are going to, or what the viruses are going to be in the future. So this was sort of a phony solution to those 2 problems to get around regulatory hurdles. Here in 2004, there were some cases of bird flu again in Vietnam, and they had vaccines from the year before, these mock-up vaccines. And so the World Influenza Center said, look, we could potentially roll out the mock-up vaccines to Vietnam to protect people in Asia. However, he said these viruses, I think he meant these vaccines, may be viewed as genetically modified organisms. And so some countries may take a more lenient view of that than other countries. What he meant was some countries would require the mock-up vaccines to go through a more rigorous regulatory process as GMOs than others. So it wasn't clear whether they could convince Vietnam to roll out these mock-up vaccines for a disease that never transmitted human to human. In fact, in the history of the world, there have been less than 900 cases of bird flu in humans and less than 500 deaths.
So I guess it doesn't spread very easily between humans, even though it is deadly.
It doesn't spread at all between humans, not at all. So here we are in 2004. Now we find out 100 million birds had to be slaughtered, or it was decided they would be slaughtered because there were 32 people infected and it killed over 20. And in Hong Kong, the government banned live chicken imports from the mainland.
So is it deadly for the birds?
It was deadly for some of the birds, and this is 20 years ago. It was deadly for people for 60% of the people who got it then. It is no longer. This virus has mutated to be very mild for humans today. We'll get to that. Okay. Okay, here we are in 2005. The powers that be decided to create fear over bird flu. And this woman, Laurie Garrett, who is a journalist who had won a Pulitzer Prize writing a book about the CDC, then went to work for the Council on Foreign Relations, which is, a globalist, the major globalist organization within the US. And she did a tour around the United States predicting a dire emergency from bird flu. You can see, she said, I attended one of her lectures, and so I remember that she was spreading terrible fear and misrepresenting the facts. She said here, the catastrophic potential of an avian flu pandemic ranks just below that for thermonuclear war. At that point in 2005, more than 300 chickens had been killed to contain the virus. And she warned the students at MIT that it quickly kills humans under the age of 35. So we can see now that a narrative was being created about this virus. And in 2007, the EU approved one of these mock-up viruses. That means they licensed it. And this one, now, if you want to push out a vaccine very quickly and be sure that it has a powerful immune stimulant effect, you add a novel adjuvant, in this case, the adjuvant MF59, which contains squalene and non-specifically causes an immune reaction to the antigens in the vaccines. But it also can cause autoimmune problems. So this comes from, what I've got on this slide comes from physician and vaccine expert Tom Jefferson, who is in the UK and in Italy. He led the Cochrane collaboration group that assessed vaccines for about 20 years or 15 years. He points out that all of these organizations that actually looked at the idea of mock-up vaccines showed that the concept was completely flawed. The National Vaccine Advisory Committee in 2008 pointed out that there are no data available that would allow an extrapolation to another antigen from a mock-up vaccine. The WHO in 2007 stated, because of the inherent variability in the assays that measure immune responses, you can't directly compare the results from different studies. In 2003, the WHO again warned that if you use an adjuvant like MF59 to enhance the immune response to one vaccine antigen, that doesn't mean you can extrapolate the response to another vaccine antigen. In other words, again, the mock-up isn't going to give you a reliable idea of what's going to happen with another vaccine. And the European Medicines Agency in 2005 said the same thing. The adjuvant effects are unpredictable, and therefore a final safety evaluation of the newly developed vaccine has to be conducted with clinical trials. In other words, you can't use the mock-up concept to roll out vaccines quickly. However, this didn't stop the industry and government regulators. Here, this came from the UN's Food and Agriculture Organization, and what they said was, even if you vaccinate the chickens, vaccination increases resistance of poultry to disease, but does not eliminate the possibility that infection may occur in a flock. In other words, they did not, despite the fact that they were vaccinating chickens at this point, the vaccines were not terribly effective. Now let's look at some of the gain-of-function research that was very controversial and led to a moratorium on gain-of-function research for bird flu and for SARS. So Yoshihiro Kawaoka and his colleague, Yoshihiro is at the University of Wisconsin, and Ron Fouchier at Erasmus University in Netherlands were both working on making bird flu virus transmit to humans and transmit through human to human through an airborne method. And in 2011, 2012, 2013, they were doing this research. It became very controversial. It was paid for by Tony Fauci's organization, as well as the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation and the Japanese government. Hundreds of scientists wrote to the US government. They didn't want this research published. They didn't want the recipe for how to make these viruses jump human to human published. And a moratorium in 2014 was placed on gain-of-function research, this type of research in the United States, paid for by the federal government. So the Obama administration allegedly stopped this type of research.
Yes. Was it also, did they say that it should be done because they would wanted to find out that what could happen with these viruses? Yeah, this is the same thing that with SARS.
Yes, that was the justification. We never know what's going to happen. So if we get ahead of what happens in nature, we'll find out how to fight it. But of course, if you do that and what you discover is proliferated, you're basically creating biological weapons. Scientists and Tony Fauci's organization didn't like to admit that, in fact, they were creating biological weapons. And it was also of interest that they started doing this after the Defense Department of the United States came to Tony Fauci around 2004 and asked him to take over a lot of the military's biological defense research. And the military started funding Tony's agency, and they raised his salary by 60%. So he agreed to do the extra work if they paid him for it. So that is how Tony Fauci became the highest paid employee of the US government, earning more than the president. This is a slide from BARDA and the CDC. BARDA is the Biomedical Advanced Research and Development Authority of the Department of Health and Human Services that Fauci's organization is also under. And although this is 2018, they were, in this case, there are many more slides. So if you go to the website that I had in the last slide, you can find out a lot more about various gain-of-function research projects that were being done between 2011 and 2020. But I've just picked out that one as an example. This shows you that they were testing in 2018 pre-pandemic or mock-up vaccines that had been stored for 10 to 12 years, tested them, said they think they're still effective. In other words, we can use these old expired vaccines on people if we want to. Here in 2016, again from BARDA, you can see that another vaccine with an adjuvant similar to MF59, another adjuvant that really strengthens the immune response, but it strengthens the immune response to everything, including sometimes one's own proteins or tissues. This mock-up vaccine was actually approved by the FDA for a license in 2016, and this was an H5N1. The vaccine that was shipped to Finland for use is an H5N8, which I'll talk about.
Yeah.
Okay, so here's another. This one is a monoclonal antibody, not a vaccine, for treatment of an H7N9 bird flu. And what you can see is that this was developed at CDC, but the NIH, Fauci's agency, is the licensing contact. So what we learn is that U.S. public health agencies became generators of pandemic products. And when they are able, and they are then trying to sell them to manufacturing companies, licensing them so that the inventors can get royalties. Because of the Bayh-Dole Act, U.S. government employees can collect up to $150,000 per year indefinitely in royalties for products that are licensed to private industry.
Yeah, so there's clear profit available
Yes,
for doing this.
Exactly. So you have a major conflict of interest when the federal agencies that are making decisions about how to respond are producing the products to respond, and they're also putting out the publicity about how dangerous the problem is. So here in 2015, again, there were some cases of bird flu. Again, it was only in birds in the United States. There was no human case in the United States, not a single one ever, until 2022. But they found some, and you can't wipe out bird flu because it's in wild birds as well. So as long as wild birds can transmit to birds that we eat, there will always be some bird flu virus.
So one question, can bird flu come into humans if you eat a bird that had a bird flu?
If you cook the meat, no, you don't get it. So they claimed there was a rapidly expanding avian flu outbreak, and by announcing this, if the governor announces an emergency, the governor now has new powers to impose on the farmers. And so this is what happened, and 3 states claimed emergencies back in 2015, although most people weren't aware of this. Now, in 2017, here is Jeremy Farrar, who the third from the left.
Yeah, recognize.
Bill Gates is the second from the right.
Yeah, I have watched this.
So they have announced at Davos in January of 2017, this organization, this company, nonprofit company, CEPI, Coalition on Epidemic Preparedness Innovation. And they promise they are going to make vaccines in 100 days. And they want to get lots of donations from the nations, from the countries for this organization. And they've gotten billions of dollars in donations. And also Jeremy Farrar at the Wellcome Trust had Wellcome Trust donate, and Bill Gates donated. Now, we know you can't do this. You can't make a safe vaccine in 100 days, but they plan, by using the mock-up vaccines and by cutting corners everywhere, they claimed they could do this, develop it in 100 days, and then manufacture it in 30 more days by sending or building manufacturing facilities in all the countries around the world.
So idea with the mock-up vaccine is that you have a kind of a platform, and then when you have a new strain, you just add a new strain, and they claim that this would work.
Yes.
This is what Hanna Nohynek I understood that she talked about that this would work like this.
Yes, and it turns out that in 2009, when we had a big swine flu scare, the pandemic's vaccine was authorized in 5 days based on the earlier authorization of the mock-up vaccine. 5 days. And this was a vaccine that led well over 1,000 adolescents to develop severe narcolepsy, which was an autoimmune result.
Yeah, I guess the thing is that the politicians like this kind of thing that, okay, now there's a pandemic and you have something that you can promise people fast, that here's a remedy.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. It immunizes the politicians, saying they didn't do anything. All right. Now, in the United States, it turns out we already have 3 fully licensed basically mock-up bird flu vaccines for human. The latest one was licensed in 2020. These are H5N1. So the H stands for the kind of hemagglutinin in the virus, one of the proteins, and the N stands for neuraminidase. There are many versions of each, and each of these two proteins are immunogenic. In other words, they stimulate an immune response. So they are what is used in vaccines against flu viruses, both human seasonal flus and bird flu. This was the latest one, Audens, but if you read the package insert, and I've simply pulled all of this information from the package insert, the only thing I wrote was this little box here, and this, FDA licensed. Fatal severe adverse events included 11, 0.5% in the Audens recipients, and 1 in the placebo recipients. In other words, if you got this vaccine in the clinical trial, you were 5 times as likely to die as if you got the placebo. And yet FDA licensed it. Again, starting around 2020, FDA went off the rails, as did EMA, and started licensing, vaccines that could kill us. Now, at the same time, a narrative was being recreated over bird flu. So in the New York Post, they quote, "Scientists say an apocalyptic bird flu could wipe out half of humanity." And by 2022, this is from The Guardian in Europe, the avian flu has now led to the killing of 140 million birds just since last October, from October to December in Europe and maybe the US, and the US also, 140 million birds were culled in 2022.
But how many of these birds would actually die of the disease?
Almost none. So what happens is if a bird
you could
dies,
eat the meat anyway.
and you could eat the meat anyway, but they're being thrown in the trash. The problem, so here's how it works. If you have a bird that is sick or dies, you have to test it. And if the test, usually with a PCR test, and if the test is positive, you have to send the test, or maybe the bird also, to the CDC in the United States, or the FDA, or the USDA. And then they test it. They have a test that only the government can do. It's not available privately or commercially. And then they decide whether the bird died of bird flu. And if they tell you the bird died of bird flu, you have to kill every bird in the chicken house. And in some situations, you have to kill every bird in the farm. Now, in some cases, the farmers went along with this because they were paid for each chicken they had to kill by the government. Okay, so in some countries, they were paid, but in other countries, they weren't paid. So obviously, they don't want to report if they're not going to be paid.
Yes,
well, you don't have to pay much for a chicken, but when you're talking about cows, you have to pay a lot more if you're telling farmers to cull their cows. Because a chicken might be worth $2 or $3, but a cow might be worth $1,000.
Yes.
Okay, so now we're up to early 2024. This is from February. And the Daily Mail just revealed that, yes, the United States is collaborating with Chinese scientists to do gain-of-function work on bird flu virus strains. And what we know is that, in fact, the United States was collaborating with scientists around the world to do this work, starting at least since 2011. And the world's citizens are allowing this to go on, even though potentially it could cause a serious pandemic. So the bird flu now is not very serious. There are 3 people since 2022 in the United States that have tested positive for bird flu. The first person was a prisoner who was killing the chickens in one of these outbreaks. And he reported that he was fatigued for 4 days. And even though the federal agencies were trying to test all the workers who were working with these birds, they couldn't find cases. The second case was earlier this year. One person working with birds and maybe cows also, who developed conjunctivitis. In other words, infection under the eyelid. And that person got better.
Yeah, that's quite far from half of the population of
exactly.
The globe.
The third person, they say, caught it from a cow. And that person got an infection of the eyelid and a cough. And that person also got better. And so it's very important to realize that the disease they're talking about from 20 years ago no longer exists. And nobody is dying from bird flu anymore. And so the strategies that were used to control it 20 years ago are no longer appropriate for the present time. All right. Robert Redfield was being interviewed. He's the former CDC director. He said, we know the 5 mutations that are necessary to make bird flu more dangerous and transmit human to human, and that he could produce that himself in a laboratory in weeks to months. Jerome Adams, who sent this tweet, was Trump's Surgeon General. And this was dated May 30th. He was simply pushing the pandemic narrative that while you're paying attention to the elections, don't forget about bird flu. We still have a potential pandemic brewing. This is from The Guardian. And they're building the narrative further. Okay, we've got bird flu. When do we pull the trigger? When do we start the vaccinations?
Yes, it almost seems like people like pandemics.
Exactly.
Just enjoy being in this state.
Right. It makes the scientists who work on this, it makes them important. If they've invented any products, they stand to potentially get $1 million or more in royalties over a number of years. So they're hoping their products make it to market. This is Peter Marks. He is the head of vaccines at FDA. And he says he's confident in the bird flu mock-up vaccine stockpile. This was April 2nd. He said there's probably a pretty low threshold to pull the trigger here. In other words, people could start getting Audens, the vaccine that killed 5 times as many people who got it as the placebo group. There was another expert, Dr. Luciana Borio, who was the former chief scientist at the FDA, and she questioned the vaccine's potency. So she probably knows as much about this because she's in the biodefense field as Peter Marks. And she said, I'm not as confident. But that doesn't mean they won't use it, even if it's not potent. Even if it doesn't work, that doesn't necessarily stop them because there can be so much money involved.
Yeah, and even if you use it and then no one gets sick, then you can say that, well, okay, it worked.
Yes, exactly. This is from the website of the American Association of Medical Colleges. So this is what they're teaching medical students. Medical students, and doctors actually need to know the truth about bird flu. So they point out that there have been a total of 889 human cases of this H5N1 bird flu. And the most common symptoms in people were the eye redness, cough, etc. They claim pneumonia, but that was in the old cases, not the new ones. They point out that 463 of these cases resulted in death, but they were all from many years ago. And that the first known case in the US occurred in 2022, and that this, as of now, this is a low-risk situation for humans. Sorry. However, everybody's excited because now there's a reason to make vaccines. So researchers at the University of Pennsylvania have already developed a bird flu vaccine from mRNA. And this man on the right is Drew Weissman, who just got a Nobel Prize for his COVID vaccine a few months ago. Now, but all the bird flu cases are not H5N1. So back in 2021 in Russia, there was an H5N8 virus that infected 8 people. But this is very interesting. Follow-up tests, 7 people. Follow-up tests on the 7 workers from the poultry farm suggested recent infection with the virus, though they showed no symptoms. No symptoms. They tested positive. This is the virus that was cultured, was stored and cultured, and this is what your vaccine has been made from, a mock-up vaccine from this virus.
Yeah.
Now, this Seqirus H5N8 vaccine has not been studied in humans. We don't know if it's been studied in animals either. Here I have the website for the EMA, which gives you all the information. And
Hanna Nohunek said in a phone call that it has been studied in animals, but that's what all she said.
yes, so the problem with studying vaccines in animals is that you cannot test efficacy in animals unless you have shown, at least these are the rules for the FDA that were very strictly followed in the old days. Unless you have shown that the animal model acts like the human when they're infected, you can't use the animal model for testing. And you can never use an animal model for safety testing. You can use an animal model for effectiveness testing if you've shown that the animal response mimics the human response. But animals never act the same as humans in terms of the safety issues, and you can't ask an animal how it feels. So basically, you have to test for safety in humans, and that has not been done. What they did instead was they looked at these 2 other mock-up vaccines, one from this, so this is your vaccine. This is the vaccine in Finland, the H5N8. What they did is they said, we took 2 other vaccines, this one, A Vietnam of an H5N1, and we took another one, A Turkey down here of an H5N1, and we can tell you what the efficacy and the side effects were in those 2, and we're just going to assume that the H5N8 vaccine in Turkey is the same without any testing. And you can read that at this EMA website that I've given you on the left. And yet, I collected some other information from the EMA website that they published before they got into this current little boondoggle. And in this case, the European Medicine Agency admits that, in fact, pandemic influenza vaccines need to be specifically developed against the strain of virus causing the pandemic, which in this case is the H5N1, not the H5N8 from Russia. Vaccines can only be prepared once a pandemic has started, and yet you're being given vaccines that were prepared long ago for a pandemic that doesn't exist.
How do they know that H5N8 would be coming in Finland? And why is it?
Know.
Yeah,
they
and why is it?
It's
for birds. Why is it given to fur traders?
So it's being given. They want to give it to farmers who are going to be in contact with birds, poultry.
But here it is given to those that are growing fur. I mean.
Oh, really? Okay.
Yes.
Okay. So look, my guess is that basically the EU and the United States need human data for these vaccines before they can roll them out to larger populations. And they talked the regulators in Finland into using them and using your population as the clinical trial. That's my guess.
It seems so, yeah. Finnish are guinea pigs.
So you can look up this website. I've given you the URL. and you can find out that Finland is going against what this says. They can be authorized, but they can't be marketed before a pandemic, and you don't have a pandemic right now, as far as I know. Maybe you do, but not of H5N8. And when I looked up the approvals in Europe, this H5N8 vaccine is not approved in Europe. And I found this dated June 10, only 9 days ago, which says there are no active cases in humans or in cattle in the European Union, according to the European Center for Disease Prevention and Control. So, of course, in order to stimulate interest and get people worried, the WHO and others, including the University of Minnesota, claimed that a man died from bird flu in Mexico. You know, the authorities have been very anxious to find a recent death from bird flu. However, it turned out, and so the WHO announced this death, but the Mexican Ministry of Health said, no, this man did not die of bird flu. He was very seriously ill. He was on his last legs, and somebody tested him before he died and found bird flu. But no, he died of kidney failure and multi-organ failure. So this was very interesting, and the WHO had to take back its claim that there was a bird flu death. So then, not to be outdone, the WHO found another bird flu infection in a human. This one was in India. It's an H9N2. They say there was a child who got sick, a 4-year-old. I think this 4-year-old tested positive for 4 different viruses, but WHO decided it must be the bird flu that made him sick.
So this bird flu virus could be found from people somewhere, but it would not necessarily make people sick. So it travels all over somehow.
Yes.
Like
So it's
do.
wild birds, and wild birds migrate. So there are birds around the world who have been infected with this bird flu. Some get sick, some die, many live. Most probably live and get over it.
So is it so that if we take like 10,000 people and just start finding bird flu viruses from them, you would eventually find someone?
Probably, yes.
Yeah.
So now we're up to bird flu vaccines for cows, as well as for people. So the government agencies claim that that the bird flu has now gotten into cows, and that it's making some sick, some have died, and some are not ill at all. They won't tell us how many. Probably most are asymptomatic or mild, and they're saying that the bird flu is in the milk. However, any bird flu in the milk is dead, because even though the federal agencies are able to test with a PCR for a little piece of the bird flu virus, they have been unable to culture even one sample of milk with live bird flu virus in it. So you can't catch this virus from milk. But that hasn't stopped them. They're warning everybody about raw milk, even though they haven't found any live virus in the raw milk.
So it's the same thing, I guess, that they're finding SARS-CoV-2 virus in the sewer water.
Exactly.
Yeah. So you find remnants of it, but
yes, exactly. But what does that mean? You can find remnants of lots of things in any liquid. Depending how many cycles you run the PCR, you can find anything. This was a worrying article that came out yesterday in Reuters, and they point out that since bird flu was discovered in cows in the United States in March, the stock price of Moderna has gone up by 40%, over $20 billion rise in the value of this company, because the market, the investors know that the US government wants to make the new vaccines from mRNA.
Yeah. Having one PCR test and one news somewhere would raise the stock of a pharma company.
So pandemic experts are very concerned, and this is from the UN. Jeremy Farrar, who was the head of the Wellcome Trust, is now the chief scientist at the WHO. And he has spent the last 20 years actually telling people that this is going to be the next pandemic, that this is something to worry about. And so he's claiming it still has extremely high mortality rates, although it no longer does because it's mutated. However, if you look at the bottom, you'll see that vaccine development is not where we need it to be. And he also pointed out that regional offices and county offices and public health authorities around the world don't have the capability to diagnose bird flu. Neither is it the case that any of these authorities have the capability to diagnose bird flu. In other words, you need the government tests to diagnose it. Yeah, so how real is it?
So does this mean that the Finnish THL officials would have a capability of diagnosing this?
Well, I'm not sure what it means, but this is from the UN. And this is from April of this year. Now, so then the question is, well, is it high? Does it cause high mortality or doesn't it? Well, the Biden administration said it isn't bird flu is not a potential pandemic pathogen. It's not dangerous. And they're taking bird flu out of the risky research rules. In other words, in the United States, because we're following the Biological Weapons Convention, if you do research with very dangerous viruses or bacteria or fungi that could cause a pandemic, you have to report it to CDC, you have to do it under high containment, and there are a lot of rules. Well, because this is no longer causing deaths, it used to be that bird flu was subject to these rules, but the federal government, as of last month, has taken it out of the select agent list, and it won't have to follow the rules. So US relaxes regulations for labs handling bird flu samples last month. This is from the WHO, a webinar they gave on bird flu and milk and cows. They often will pool different samples of milk together and test the pooled samples. And they found 20% of commercially sold pasteurized milk in their pools tested positive on the PCR test. But what does that mean? Nobody has gotten bird flu from drinking milk, and no live infectious virus has been cultured or detected in any of these samples. And this is around the world. And in fact, if you pasteurize milk, you'll kill any virus that might be there.
Yeah, isn't that the idea of pasteurization?
It is. It is. So why do we have to worry about it? And my last slide is just a reminder that this is from 2015. Several mock-up vaccines for H5N1 have been licensed. They are developed so that you can generate a package for the regulators, and then you use that package to license a new pandemic vaccine when you don't know much about it. However, you really need to give extra care to the safety profile because you have no idea how safe or unsafe this new vaccine that you're cooking up is going to be. And the new vaccine can cause autoimmunity, which is cross-reactivity with self-proteins. That means autoimmune disease. So I'm just reminding people again that the idea of using mock-up vaccines and then pulling out a new antigen at the last minute, inserting it, and claiming that you have a licensed or authorized product is a very, very bad idea for vaccines. And that's the end of my presentation.
Yes. So thank you. This was a quite good package. I got some questions that, so does this vaccine H5N8 that comes to Finland, it has the same adjuvant that was dangerous?
Yes, the Seqirus vaccine has the MF59 adjuvant, which is potentially dangerous. It can stimulate autoimmunity. We don't know if it will, because the vaccine hasn't been tested in humans, but in some other vaccines, it has been used in a few vaccines, but not very many, very, very few. And the owner of the adjuvant, this adjuvant has been around for 27 years. And I've studied it in the past. It was very difficult to get information because the manufacturer didn't really license it, didn't allow people who weren't employees to study it. It was added to a flu vaccine for babies in Canada recently, about about 8 years ago. It was added to a vaccine only for children under the age of 2 or 2.5 in Canada before it was licensed in any other country in the world for little children. And so I think the Canadian babies were being used as an experiment. It wasn't the only flu vaccine available. So I think most offices were not giving it out, but they licensed it. So it was probably used in some sort of trials in Canada. It's been used in a flu shot for elderly people in Italy. And it's been used 1 or 2 other vaccines, but there's a very limited safety profile on MF59.
So as this Hanna Nohunek said that this vaccine that we are getting, that there would be human trials, but this sounds quite weird because because they are also planning to start using it on Finnish farmers in this summer.
Yes, you need to ask, was the clinical trial done with the H5N1 vaccine from Turkey or Vietnam or somewhere else? Or was it done with this virus vaccine, the version from Astrakhan, Russia?
Yes, if we only could get people to know and ask, this is
right.
And I cannot.
Was it done with MF59 added?
Yeah. Still, I don't understand why is it given to farmers that grow fur.
So there are other animals besides cows that have been said to have this, and I assume they've either found it in those animals or they're expecting to find it in those animals.
I guess they claim that they have found some way, if I remember correctly, but well, claimed. One thing I wanted to ask you about that is, which is also related to SARS-CoV-2, that what is a medical countermeasure?
For SARS-CoV-2?
Or what is the general idea of medical countermeasure? Or is this vaccine a medical countermeasure also if it comes from this BARDA hand?
All right. So in the United States, if you designate something a medical counter, if the Secretary of Health and Human Services, and originally it could also be a designation from the Secretary of Defense or the Secretary of Homeland Security, a countermeasure, then it did not need to go through normal regulatory processes, and it could be rolled out as an emergency use authorized product. And there actually didn't have to be necessarily any testing at all on it before it rolls out. So there was no liability for anyone for the product, the manufacturer, the doctor who issues it, the government who authorizes it, etc. So that's what the term medical countermeasure means in the United States. And it could be a vaccine, a drug, a monoclonal antibody. It could be a PCR test. It could be a ventilator.
Mm. So is this vaccine that Finland is getting now, is it also a medical countermeasure?
Well, I just told you what medical countermeasure means in the United States. I don't know what it means in Finland. It's a legal meaning in the United States. But what it means is that in the United States, because of the PrEP Act, you can't sue anyone. So if you take that countermeasure and you die or you're injured, you can't sue anyone. And only 13 people in the United States have actually gotten any money for injuries from the COVID vaccines, which were designated as countermeasures. And on average, they only got $4,000 each. So there's one small program to pay people. So you can't sue, but there's a government program. Tax money is put in a pot to pay people who may be injured by countermeasures. But there are about 12,000 people who have applied for funding from this program, and only 13 so far have received it, and very little money, even if someone died.
But so if this is a medical countermeasure in US and it is given by Finnish authorities to Finnish people and Finnish people die, then, and if the authorities...
You have no rights. My guess is that it's being rolled out by the EU, not by the United States, and that this is an EU mock-up vaccine, and it may or may not have anything to do with the United States, but the EU is like the United States. I mean, NATO is like the US military. I don't know why an H5N8 vaccine was chosen when the bird flu that we're seeing in the United States is the H5N1. I can't tell you that, but they claim that because the H5, the hemagglutinin antigen is the same, it will still provide immunity, even though the neuraminidase antigen will not. That's the claim. But you don't know if a vaccine provides immunity until you test it, because it's impossible to predict. That's been proven over and over for many decades. You can never predict what a vaccine is going to do until you test it in people.
I guess it's quite obvious that in United States that these officials, healthcare officials, are quite often corrupted. But it seems to me that the Finnish officials, they just don't care or know. I made several calls in a couple of years to Finnish officials. They just always tell that okay, CDC and FDA, they have been testing these things, and so we trust them. Why do you think this is?
Well, 30 years ago, the FDA was a very good regulatory agency, and then certain laws were passed in the United States that allowed them to relax or weaken their regulatory rules, and allowed scientists at these agencies to collect money for what they produce, their inventions, and the quality of regulation has gone down to nothing. So they should never trust us. It turns out that in 2009, when the pandemrix vaccine was causing narcolepsy, it was Finland. It was a woman doctor from Finland who blew the whistle. So Finland actually was, very reliable. I was very impressed with the work of Finland at that time.
Well, so that has also changed here. I have got this impression that they don't care or don't know or don't want to know. They just do their work, which is it's really surprising.
That seems to be the case here in the US also.
Yeah, it seems to be the case all over the world now. They said that there's about 20,000 doses of this vaccine reserved for Finnish farmers. Now that
will be sufficient for a clinical trial.
I wonder if they're going to make a study of it, or Or maybe is that really the reason for it?
Probably someone will collect the data, but sometimes nobody collects the data. We're living in a very strange time.
Yes, I got a feeling that things just happen. They just snowball, and everyone just accepts and does his thing. And this craziness is just often it seems to be just result of this, that people don't care.
Well, I think it's not a question that we don't care, but people don't realize how bad things can be. I mean, we assume that the FDA is doing its job and that the CDC and the USDA, which is the agricultural agency, are looking out for our welfare. I mean, that's what they were founded to do. Why would we assume that they're trying to harm us? Right? I mean, it doesn't make sense that they're trying to harm us. But in fact, for reasons that are complex, and some of them are financial, they're not actually carrying out their mission. And the other problem is that people don't know, they don't know that they can be like you and me. We can look these things up ourselves. We can discover what's going on. We can spread the information. We're not powerless. You know, you don't have to be a rocket scientist to look at the EMA website and find out, is this a licensed vaccine? Is H5N8 actually infecting animals in Finland? And if you don't, and, you know, can you use a pre-pandemic vaccine before a pandemic occurs and be guaranteed that it's going to actually work against the virus that shows up when there's a pandemic? Of course not. So you can find all that out by simply going to the EMA website the way I did. But people don't realize that there is an EMA website and this information is on it. And of course, I'm a doctor, so I know how to understand the language, and not everybody does. But a lot of people who are not professionals, you know, if you're inquisitive, you can go to these websites and learn a lot. So I appreciate you trying to get the message out. People need full informed consent. They need to have it explained to them that this is a vaccine for a disease that does not appear to exist anywhere. The disease was found in 7 asymptomatic. In other words, they were perfectly well. Animal workers in Astrakhan, Russia in 2021. And it doesn't seem to exist anywhere else. But now people in Finland are being given a vaccine for it. And do they know why? Do they know that it's unlikely to protect them against anything, and that there are risks, and that no one's tested it in people before? That's what they need to be told. That's informed consent.
Yes. Yeah, and the problem is that also why you lost your license is that you started talking, and that's because no journalist actually often dares to speak about these things now, because it sounds so crazy. Then you get this stigma of being a mad person.
It sounds totally crazy. And if I didn't look up the documents myself, I wouldn't have believed it. But the documents are available. And so unfortunately, we need a new paradigm for what's going on.
Yeah. Well, thank you. Thank you, Meryll Nass, for this information.
Thank you very much.
Okay.
Bye.